Hi, everyone. Welcome to Green Sunday, a free monthly
Thank you.
program and discussion on political topics of the day, hosted by the Green Party of Alameda County. Today is April 10th, 2022. We will be exploring the current state of political discourse in American society and media, which is one of extreme polarization, hyper-partisanship, and siloed information. People on opposing sides of an issue are challenged to even reach a point where they can agree to disagree on most issues anymore. And this has a lot to do with the portrayal of these issues in the dominant media. How can we reestablish a more tolerant and centered public discourse? What is the media's role in facilitating a transition to greater civility rather than further division? With us today to address these questions and more is Mickey Huff. Mickey is an award-winning author and professor of social science, history, and journalism at Diablo Valley College. Huff is executive producer and host of the Project Censored Show, a weekly syndicated public affairs program that airs across the US on Pacifica Radio. Mr. Huff has just co-written a book that discusses the origins of and solutions for our current hyper-partisanship. The book is titled, Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy. I am pleased now to turn the floor over to Mickey to present an overview of the book, followed by questions and discussion on this urgent topic.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate that introduction. And thanks to all of the Alameda Greens for actually inviting me back. I was here, I believe, last summer. We were talking, Nolan Higdon and I, my serial offending partner in crime, Nolan is, we did United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What You Can Do About It. We did that at City Lights in 2019. And we had some interesting conversations last time. And now we just had this book come out in February. It's a Rutledge textbook. It's a critical thinking textbook. It's based on a lot of our teachings. For me, going back over 20 years, and certainly for Nolan going back at least the last decade. Nolan couldn't be with us today, but he certainly sends his regards to everyone. And he also was grateful that we have this opportunity to share this information. And really, that's what this is about. It's about sharing information. It's about sharing pedagogy and curriculum. It's about sharing strategies. It's about hearing things that are maybe not easy to hear or digest or process in a lot of ways. And also, of course, I had another book come out with my other serial partner in media literacy crime. That would be Andy Lee Roth. The latest annual Project Censored book is out, State of the Free Press 2022. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of overlap between these issues. So I imagine that some of that might come up here today. So I don't think I'm this isn't the right setting for lecturing and talking forever, one person talking too long. That's kind of part of the problem sometimes, isn't it? So despite the fact that brevity is not one of my strong points, I'm going to try to keep things a little shorter, maybe 20, 30 minutes, hopefully. And really interested in opening it up to you all. And then maybe that can be another way to get into some of the contents of the book. So since it is a book, and since I'm here to talk about the book, why don't we talk about from the introduction, why should we agree to disagree? And then I might address briefly a little bit on what that means, right? Because that's ripe for, it's really kind of ripe for interpretation. And, you know, we before the book was out and people even read it, we were being roundly criticized for being two white males that were going to explain to people how they had to run their arguments. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth, but you know, people do try to judge a book by the cover, especially when they don't read it and just look at the authors online. But ironically, this book is for those people. And a lot of the people that might need to read this book are likely the people that won't. And that's why we need to get the word out and we need to kind of share the strategies and so on. Here's a quote, and I'll see if you guess when it's from. The destiny of the entire human race depends on what is going on in America today. This is a staggering reality to the rest of the world. They must feel like passengers in a supersonic jetliner who are forced to watch helplessly while a passel of drunks, hypes, freaks, and madmen fight for the controls and the pilot's seat. Well, 3 years later, these words were published in a collection of essays titled Soul on Ice. So that was a quote from the Folsom State Prison cell in 1965 of American writer, activist, early Black Panther Party member, later Republican candidate for government, Eldridge Cleaver. And we started the book with that quote for several reasons. One, it's a time machine. Is it now? Is it 1965 and 68? Is it the Reconstruction period? Is it the tumultuous period 100 years ago when the US was coming out of the throes of a massive global industrial war, first major Red Scare and Russophobia and anti-communist scare, another raging pandemic, a thirst for law and order and crackdowns and deportations. As an historian and a journalist, I'm always I'm always time traveling. And these kinds of quotes remind us that this may be unique to us now, and there are certainly differences about the things that are happening around our world today and the challenges we face. There is a uniqueness about them, but there are also some similarities, and there are things that we can learn when we listen to history, and we don't just try to use it as a weapon. So I started with that quote simply because astronaut Frank Borman went on to describe what it was like to be on the Apollo 8 in 1968 and said, to see the Earth in its entirety, you're going to get a concept that maybe this really is one world, and why the hell can't we learn to live together like decent people? Well, now instead of people like Frank Borman going into space, we've got people like Jeff Bezos and billionaire oligarchs going into space for joyrides. Certainly things have changed in that regard. And of course, we also have an exacerbated sort of sense of the situation and the challenges we face that we outlined in the United States of Distraction. When we started that book, and again, I'm going to just tell this story quickly, because this book, the Let's Agree to Disagree book, is really a follow-up to the United States of Distraction book. And we started that with a quote from Lao Tzu that said, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. Well, are we there yet, right? And of course, we can keep asking that question throughout. Are we there yet? We outlined 4 major issues that took well over half a century to get us to the place where we now are. Many, particularly many liberals and people on the left, see this happening over the Trump era. But this was long in the making. These challenges and these things that have been happening, these didn't happen overnight. And we outlined, Nolan and I, 4 public vulnerabilities. And I want to address those because this Rutledge book, Let's Agree to Disagree, is really based on dealing with these 4 challenges that we believe are extraordinarily relevant as root causes of our current dilemma. We have a pervasive commercial entertainment culture. Probably not going to get much argument there. In fact, it's become increasingly more and more commercial as the years have gone on and owned by fewer corporations. We're now dealing with a handful, maybe 5, that control most of the media in the US, and about 4 or 5 tech companies with social media, the internet, and we'll get into some of those problems in a little while. Of course, we're also dealing with record levels of hyper-partisanship, even in the 1950s when the United States was incredibly divided in many ways. Hyper-partisanship has really eclipsed that period extraordinarily. In fact, recent polls, when asking the American public what they're most concerned about, or more significantly from the media, corporate media angle, what do Americans fear the most, right? Because the corporate media and both major corporate parties like to use fear as a lever for public control. It's not COVID-19. It's not Russia or the threat of nuclear war, even though we have this massive war raging in Eastern Europe with the Russian invasion and bombing of Ukraine. It's not climate crisis, which is going to get all of us, but it's not that. The thing that polls highest on America's fear list is other Americans. And so we need to really think about what forces have worked to create that perception in the American public, and sort of manufacture in many ways this extraordinary irrational fear of each other, of our neighbors. we're more inclined to agree with a paid propagandist at a corporate media outlet because of our confirmation bias than actually go across the street for 5 minutes and try to make sense of what our neighbor's doing. And that's a real problem. That's a really serious problem that sociologists have been looking at for half a century. Also people that are very interested in critical thinking, people that are interested in political science. And of course, it's exacerbated by the vast corporate control of our culture, with you all here in this audience, know that. And the rise of corporate personhood and corporate influence over our politics and over our discourse has definitely gone away, in many cases, far away from the public interest. And that's a key part of the problem that we have. Well, another major problem is we have an extraordinarily fragmented media landscape where our confirmation bias sort of steers us to the Fox News, the MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and in online, even other places, the Democracy Nows or the Steve Bannon's War Room, right? We kind of pick and choose our channels. And as a result, we're kind of limiting, in many ways, really hearing and understanding other sides of major perspectives. And many of us, including from left to right, base many of our impressions off of caricatures of each other, not actual facts or not actual sort of points about who each other are or what we're actually saying and why. And the fragmented media landscape, our echo chambers, our social media silos, those are great impediments and hurdles to learning how to agree to disagree, to learn how to talk to people who are different than we are. And of course, last but not least, we have an ineffective educational system that's been teaching to the test for years. Several studies, even just this year, that have come out have already shown that 4 decades of teaching to test, including the last 2 emphatically, have not produced the results they claimed and have basically been an utter failure. So when we look at this, what we're calling for is a critical pedagogy. We're talking about the need for a public media and education system. And we are talking about a return to the center, not ideologically, but a return to having a centered approach to education based on critical thinking, based on the ability to understand how to think critically, not be so interested in telling other people what to be thinking. And that's a key element of the book. So now I want to get to the book and talk a little bit about the overview, a couple of the strategies and things we have in the book. And then I'd rather spend some more time hearing from you all, because I know you have a lot to say. And I can use that part of our dialogue and our conversation to pull out other parts of the book based on your questions and interests. So that would be a more judicious use of our time, I think. And it's also a way to get me out of lecture mode, which is hard to do because it's kind of what I do. But even I am learning to talk less and listen more. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and listen more about that momentarily. This book, which I have listed here in the comments, if you scroll up to the top of the comments, I'll put them in later for people who came late. But there is a link to the book. There's a link to the video of Nolan and I talking about the book in particular. And the book is divided into 3 sections. And I want to point that out. We started with part 1, communication, cultural approaches to conflict management, reflecting on communication practices and censorship, the difference between constructive and destructive communication. Big, important way to start the book. We then go into critical thinking in general, inquire and be a critical thinker, test theory and spot ideology, understand the importance of critical theory as a tool for understanding the world, for understanding historiography, right? So we introduce a lot of these things in here. It's an interdisciplinary book that can be used across the social sciences and the humanities, whether it be English, philosophy, communication, history, journalism. So it has a broad interdisciplinary appeal. The second part goes into critical thinking. And the third part talks about critical media literacy in general, because it talks about the importance of media as a vehicle for messaging. So we learn how to critique content. We learn about fake news propaganda. We learn ways how to fight fake news propaganda. We learn about digital media and ownership. We learn about algorithms and bots and shadow banning and demonetization and deplatforming. We also talk about cancel culture and arguments about whether there is a cancel culture. Is there only one side or another? So all of this is in the book. And finally, in the last section, there's 4, not 3, but the 4th section I see as the culmination of all 3. And it's called Lead by Example. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And it's kind of paraphrasing Ralph Nader and many other folks over the years. And we talk about getting critical, where the word critical, CRITICAL, is an acronym for things that we can do to be better independent and critical thinkers, more empathetic listeners, and hopefully more successful communicators in ways that relate to the causes that are most dear to us. So really quickly, I wanted to reflect on why we started with communication. Constructive dialogue is civil, which means all parties involved engage in acts of reciprocity and critical thinking for purposes of strengthening our democratic culture. Well, time out. Do we have a very democratic culture? According to several studies over the last decade, we're more of a plutocracy or an oligarchy than a democratic republic. So we have challenges there. And by the way, there are a lot of people in our political spectrum that don't seem very civil at all. In fact, their entire political messaging is about incivility. It's about hostility and exclusion. So I know a lot of folks are going to finger wag, or a lot of folks will say, this is impossible. But again, the genesis for Nolan and I writing this book was that the last chapter of the United States of Distraction book was titled, maybe coyly titled, Make America Think Again. I'm not sure if we ever were more thoughtful. I'm not pining for good old days per se. But it was definitely riffing on the MAGA sensibilities, to make America great again, which begs, right, for the well, could you tell me when that was? And exactly for whom was it great and why? Because for each of those parts of the narrative, I'll go back and find 5 others that would argue that it wasn't exactly great. In fact, for many demographics, it might have been way the opposite of that. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to remind people on multiple sides of the political spectrum that we can't always believe everything we think. And it's very important to remind ourselves that we don't know everything. Broken clocks are right twice a day. And life's journey about wisdom and gaining knowledge is not done. And it's not even done when we're done. It's carried on by subsequent generations of people. And I think we have a responsibility to leave some of the best practices, to leave the knowledge and wisdom that we gain for people to digest and use for the causes they find important and they think are significant. And again, I also want to remind folks that when I'm done here with this spiel, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A and participation, and we'll have plenty of time to get into those details. But we decided to start the book. In fact, we reorganized the book with Rutledge. We had a different subtitle. We had a different order of things where we thought we got to start out with critical thinking, because if people don't understand the nuts and bolts of critical thinking and critical pedagogy, they're not going to be able to do any of the other things in the book. And we stopped a minute and we said, actually, some of the books that we've used over the years about critical thinking, particularly in history and in journalism and social science, they do start that way. But I was influenced by a couple of folks from Bowling Green State University, Brown and Keeley, who wrote an interesting book for years that's discontinued now, which also led to writing this, is I felt there needed to be something new in it, a new book that addressed these issues for the 21st century, 2021 too. And that's no matter what how critical your process, no matter how logically argued you think your point is, if you do not communicate it effectively, and if you do not understand the audience that you're trying to communicate it to, you may have a very difficult time conveying that message. However rational you find it, however truthful you find it, however transparently sourced you have worked to make it be. And so Nolan and I literally looked at people from across the political spectrum, and we looked for a lot of diverse examples. Many of the examples that we have in the book they're not about us. They're about marginalized communities, people of color. They're about other groups on another side of the political spectrum that's trying to ban certain types of ideas and essentially ban certain kinds of people, right? And so we're using these different examples, and then we pull the media lens into it, and how the media kind of sort of just show in spectacle-like fashion really show only the issues that will drive people apart as wedges. And they will work to build massive walls and silos around groups and people rather than build bridges between them. And we think that that's one of the extraordinary problems with our current commercially based for-profit corporate media system. And I don't believe that it is reformable, I'm afraid to say, despite the extraordinary efforts of the great Bob McChesney and the good people over at Free Press that we've worked with over the years. There are certainly people, Craig Aaron, Victor Picard, that have written amazingly about how to have a robust public media system, how many billions of dollars it's going to cost, how other countries and other societies have actually done a much better job than we're doing. And I laud and respect the lot of them. But I also think that while we may be trying to do those extremely important things as media activists, as it were, it's also important to do these things. It's also important to do these types of things where we're literally going and trying to teach people the importance of dialogue, the importance of critical thinking, and the importance of empathetic listening. So this is again why we started with this issue about learning how better to listen. And the title of the book is not an invitation to accept disagreement without engaging in constructive dialogue. Instead, we hope readers engage with others in areas where they may disagree. We wrote that disagreement is a normal part of the human experience, one to be managed and mitigated by constructive communication and critical discourse. Disagreement does not mean one accepts oppression or inequality. In fact, this text discusses the importance of communication and communicating boundaries. The challenge for democratic societies is how to manage such conflicts constructively by not engaging in destructive dialogue. And then we go through in great ways to talk about, well, what exactly is that and what does it look like, right? What is destructive dialogue? Well, I can give you a quick heads up. It's about violence. It's about provocation. It's about condescension, patronizing, name calling. It's about assuming what other people's arguments are before they've had a chance to give them. Those are not productive practices communicatively. Instead, we talk about empathetic listening, and we talk about what it means to hear messages. We talk about how to decipher meaning for messages. And we actually quoted the philosopher Daniel Dennett in Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, where Dennett points out 4 ways that participants can demonstrate to each other that they are participated in what we call active listening. That's also called critical listening. And what we mean by that is that we attempt, number 1, to re-express another person or another party's position in a way that's clear enough and vivid enough that they may even thank you for putting it in a different way or in a way that makes just as much sense to them, right? That's a signal that you're actually paying attention. You may not agree with anything that they're saying, but you've now at least proven that you're listening, you're tuned in. Then list any points of agreement, especially if they're not matters of general or widespread agreement. In other words, we have 10 things that we disagree about. Where's something where we do disagree? Or the flip side, many of the arguments that take place on the left are subject to a circular firing squad where you'll agree on 9 out of 10 things, but you'll focus all your energy in the one area where there's disagreement, which is also not productive for political movements. The third thing is mention something that you may have learned from another person or a party that you didn't know. This expresses to somebody that you're not a know-it-all. It also expresses to them that you're curious. And that means that you might be convinced. You might not be, right? Let's hold on to that. You might not be, but you're willing to change your mind if you're presented with facts and evidence in a logical way, in a reasonable way that not only respects your initial difference, but isn't necessarily wedded to your disagreement. In other words, it recognizes your autonomy to make your own decisions and not be intimidated or cowed. The last is, at that juncture, only then is when should you say, that's when you should offer criticism. That's when you offer the rebuttal. That's when you go and dismantle the other argument by facts, by sources, and you take it apart. And you then say, well, look, I've just dismantled these parts of the argument. I've just disproven several things. I've just raised significant questions about a couple of the sources you may have used. Can we now continue the conversation about that? Can we bring it to the next level? if the next level is merely retreating to each other's sides, then maybe we're not ready for the next level yet, right? And maybe it's because we're not even speaking the same languages. A classic example in this country is the debates about abortion. One group talks about pro-life, one group talks about pro-choice. The language departs from there, and the ships are passing in the night, right? And so each side has a hard time getting any of their message across because they can't seem to find where the common center of discourse may lie. And therein lies the challenge of building the bridge to get people to understand, why is it important that women have the right to decide what they do with their own bodies, right? And that's a curious issue too, right? The bodily autonomy issue has been very interesting on the left in the last couple of years, because we see an increasing number of people who talk about the importance of bodily autonomy when it comes to women, but not when it comes to informed consent in COVID mandate policies. Now, I know that that's a sticky wicket, and that's something that a lot of people disagree with, and maybe that'll come up later. I'm not interested in this turning into a one-topic conversation about COVID mandates or about abortion or about Russia, Ukraine. We can talk about all those things. There's 100 other things we can talk about. I'm here to talk about the process and how we navigate those kind of things. So I'm having more of a pedagogical meta moment here. And I'm not here to have the actual argument or debate about any one particular third rail hot button issue right now. That said, I want to just get into some of the other things that we do in the book, just to give you all some more things to think about so that we can open it up for the Q&A section. Now, look, once we get into the issue of communicating, we also talk about the importance of First Amendment history. And we go through and look even at dissenting views in First Amendment history from the federal courts. And we think it's important to do that because they do illustrate that in this country, we do have free speech and free expression issues as a core value. We don't always interpret it the same. We don't always define it the same. We don't always apply it the same way. And it's changed over time. But there's always been a penchant in the United States to censor and silence people with whom we disagree, which includes acts of violence, includes jailing and deportation. It includes getting rid of people's voice. I was just this afternoon, before I met with you all, I spent a few hours grading some 50 or 60 essays on from a modern US history course that my students submitted not long ago, talking about the progressive era and talking about World War I and talking about the Espionage and Sedition Act and talking about life in the 20s. Again, I go back and look at these great challenges and I'm reminded by the history that they went and they recounted about, newspapers being shut down for having unpopular views. Again, it wasn't, Russophobia was kicking in, but in World War I, it was being afraid of anything German, banning the teaching of German, people being so fearful of being attached to Germany, they changed their German names. And then right after that, the Red Scare, right? And again, I bring this up because, we have these struggles generationally in our history. In many cases, in many ways in the present, they've been extraordinarily exacerbated by our mediated society, our heavily, extraordinarily mediated society, and the great divisiveness that has been sown, especially by social media, which I would call anti-social media, and by our major corporate-backed parties and corporate media that are very, very driven by sensationalism and fear and hostility, because they drive users and they drive eyeballs to these that interact, and then the algorithms pick that up and feed more back, and then the profits can go up and up and up on the basis of this commercial model of media profit, and it pleases shareholders and owners. So that's a huge problem we still have to face. But we also have to understand that we can learn some things from the past about our values of free speech. Of course, we also can't discuss cancel culture, definitions of cancel culture, and I have hosted a couple of people in conversations about cancel culture on the Project Censored show, whether it's talking about Dan Kovalick's progressive case against cancel culture, by talking with Lee Camp and Chris Hedges and Abby Martin about the recent deplatforming and disappearing of RT America, by Roku and DirecTV, and we talk about censorship by proxy and sort of a history of internet history by proxy, government by proxy, because the taxpayer money went all into big tech. They act like it's private for-profit business. It is, but if you look at the roots of all of this technology, it's all connected to the Pentagon. It's connected to the Cold War, right? It's very important that we remember that these companies that want to be privately run and unaccountable needs to be readdressed. That needs to be challenged, not accepted, but challenged, because they have basically captured what is now in the 21st century online, the public square, where we all interact, where we all exchange our ideas. So it's really important that we talk about, why is it okay that a handful of people over at Google or over at YouTube decide what's platformed, deplatformed, demonetized, and so forth? And Nolan and I have written at length also in op-eds. He just had one last week, and I have another coming out next, about how this isn't about RT America being state media from Russia. Of course, it's going to be seen as propaganda of some kind. But if you're so busy talking about RT America as propaganda, and you don't see CNN, the New York Times, and Fox News the same way, then maybe you need to go back and fine-tune your critical media literacy skills and your critical thinking skills, because we're inundated from propaganda coming from all over. A big question to ask about the cancellation of some of these voices too is, what is driving the American left to a media system or a media outlet run by a foreign government? What does it say about the closed, myopic kind of discourse that passes for a free press in the 21st century in the United States? It should tell us a lot, right? And I know Chris Hedges is fortunate enough to have other avenues. Lee Camp is looking at other avenues, whether we look through Behind the Headlines, Mint Press, Real News Network. There are some alternative independent sources in the US that are important voices, and you all know what many of them are. I'm honored to be with Pacifica Radio on KPFA every week. And again, I will also say that I know that people on these outlets don't all agree on everything. And that's, again, what's kind of at the root here, is that at Project Censored, we really are suspicious of would-be censors. We're really suspicious of groups and people that want to curate public discourse and debate. And we have a default position that is, again, very skeptical when people tell us that certain things need to be censored. We're not close to it. We know that hateful messages that put people's lives at risk, messages that are designed to erase people from existence, we don't support that kind of rhetoric, and we need to, but we don't need to cancel it. We need to, the antidote to that is more speech that counters it, that gives people the opportunity to understand why that speech is divisive and why it's unproductive and unhelpful. And we need to do that at the same time while being allies with people in marginalized communities that they need to be more amplified and platformed in ways to make those arguments. And we make those arguments here, and we don't make them ourselves. We let people like Daryl Davis make that argument, the African-American activist that's collected over 200 Ku Klux Klan's uniforms by talking to racist white supremacists and getting them to change their minds, by getting them to realize that racism was a learned behavior that was hateful and hostile and divisive. And Daryl Davis gave these people the opportunity to learn how to be better people and learn how to be more inclusive. And that's something that's really important. And we, by the way, we also have other examples in the book that show how media will completely foul up a particular story just to get a hot take and stoke division. Facts be damned. And one of the cases that we talk about in the book was the case of Nick Sandmann. Some of you may not remember, some of you may, in the Trump presidency, a group of what I believe were mostly white conservative religious high schoolers from a private school in Ohio that went to Washington, D.C. on a trip and encountered a Native American activist that was protesting and doing things at one of the monuments. There was an interaction. It was filmed. It quickly blew up into a gotcha moment for media. filling this narrative of the white privileged MAGA hat wearing kids trying to go after and try to insult and put down Native American activists. And there's a long history in the United States of white supremacy and white violence against Native Americans. It goes all the way back, right? In fact, you can go back hundreds and hundreds of years. You can follow it through the early republic. The rough count of people, indigenous peoples killed is in the range of 15 million over 3 centuries, close to 4 centuries by the late 19th century. So it's not that we shouldn't be attuned to that, but we also shouldn't forget about why facts matter and why context matters. And the reason I bring that up is that regardless what we might think about a smug sort of image of this person confronting a Native American, we also have to remember that there was confrontation coming from another way, and the media did everything they could to distort the reality of the situation. Nick Sandmann won hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits against corporate media outlets for defamation because they lied, manufactured information, and told a story that was based on their bias and falsehoods, not what actually happened. Many people in this room may not know or may not understand that outcome, but that is something that happened. And again, it may even go against my bias and my sensibility. I know when I saw that happening, I was talking about that in my critical thinking class at the time with students, and they were all debating about what was happening. And I was telling them, I was saying like, you know, I see this happening. I'm seeing that too, but I'm saying, I think we should wait a minute. And then the longer we waited, the more people started to come in and have different perspectives and so forth, which doesn't discount what I said earlier about the extraordinary house. Look, we live in an amazingly racist culture against indigenous people to this very day. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's playing out every single place, every single day with every single participant. And that's what makes this really difficult to do. One of the biggest challenges we face is that we have to decide that we want to think critically and that we want to do these things and that we want to help other people have the opportunity to do them, which means we have to understand why logical arguments matter. We have to understand how to avoid logical fallacies and fallacious reasoning. We have to learn how to not only spot it out in ourselves, but others. We need to understand propaganda techniques. We have to understand that all media outlets can be seen as propaganda, but in one way or another. In many cases, what Voice of America is doing in Eastern Europe is similar to what RT America was doing here. Not perfect analogies, but again, similar situations. Voice of America, which is definitely pro-Western, pro-US NATO propaganda, was one of the few places where Václav Havel could speak. Going back in the Iron Curtain days. So again, I think that there's always more that we need to learn. There's always something else that maybe we didn't know that could be a key fact of addressing or re-attenuating our conclusions. I know there's a lot going on in the chat, and I'm certainly going to get to some of that here in a few moments. Moving through the book, we talk a lot, again, about these biases, and I think they're really important that we understand objectivity and cognitive bias. We should understand an unconscious and implicit bias. It's really important. It refers to ways that we unknowingly draw upon assumptions about individuals and groups to make decisions about them. A psych professor from Stanford wrote a brilliant book called Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See and What We Do, Jennifer Eberhardt. And she wrote and said that implicit bias is kind of a distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brain and the disparities of our society. She particularly focuses on the role implicit bias plays in different manifestations of racism, right, which is very important. But again, talks about how implicit bias is a real challenge. Confirmation bias, if it feels good to me, it sounds right to me, I'm gonna go with it. I don't think what you're saying sounds right. Let me go back to my sources that I already agree with to come back and repeat why you're wrong. That's a knee-jerk reaction. That's a place we start. But if we don't want to expand beyond our confirmation bias, then it doesn't appear that we have a willingness that perhaps will commit the cardinal sin of American politics, changing one's mind, right? I'm not talking about the opportunistic flip-flopping. I'm talking about what if we really do change our minds about something based on evidence, not widely popular in US politics. Self-serving bias, right? If it benefits me, I'll believe it. A curse of knowledge bias. That's displayed when an individual assumes that everyone should know what they already know. Even if I might have just learned it yesterday, my assumption is everybody knows this. Why doesn't everybody know this? Well, again, we know about the jokes about the word assume, right? Going back a number of decades to those kinds of jokes. Hindsight bias or armchair quarterbacking, we see a lot of that in media. That's not helpful or critical thinking. A declinism bias, that things were always better in the golden days, pining for the olden days, appeal to antiquity. That's not useful either. The idea that we look at things through rose-colored glasses. There's a few other things I wanted to point out, though, that are really important for our interactions with people. And one is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which sees people with more knowledge about a topic acting with caution to display they know less than they actually do, right? So, we can argue that the Trump presidency seemed to be riddled with Dunning-Kruger. In fact, in many ways, he seems to be the perfect poster person for Dunning-Kruger, right? Trump seemed to be an expert at everything, only, and in fact, he was such a candidate for Dunning-Kruger that he never seems to get to that part of the argument when he starts to realize or be embarrassed or be humbled by the fact that he may not know, right? And look, Trump is an obvious example of this, which, by the way, is why you've seen a huge spike in the use of this term and the search for this term online. But I would argue that Dunning-Kruger applies across the spectrum. We've got online, the very people that were experts on COVID public health policy are now experts on Eastern European warfare and foreign policy, right? There's this tendency, and we should check it in ourselves. We should check that tendency. The other is motivated reasoning, which is a type of cognitive bias related to confirmation bias that's spurred on by inferred justification. We look for reasons to understand something that we can understand. One of the examples we used of motivated reasoning is a lot of people that supported the war in Iraq, for example, almost over two-thirds of the population, roughly two-thirds of that percentage that supported the invasion erroneously believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that was connected to 9/11. But there had to be a reason. So they went back and started making connections that didn't necessarily factually exist because there had to be a reason. Wrapping one's head around the fact that we might have been purposely lied to or misled is very hard because it creates cognitive dissonance. But that is a harsh reality that we need to address. And finally, of course, we're reminded by people like Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, that talked about the impact or influence of pseudosciences and cherry-picking data out of context. He talks about, in particular, in The Demon-Haunted World. In 1995, Sagan warned the public, "I have a foreboding of an America in my children or grandchildren's time when people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority." He goes on to say, "Our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness." And in many cases, social media has functioned in that way. It's a world of pseudoscience. It's a world of cherry picking. It's a world of Dunning-Kruger. It's a world of motivated reasoning and inferred justification. It's a world of confirmation bias. In short, it's a world of propaganda, and it is addled with censorship, and it is the battlefield for our minds in an information war. And this is why we need all the tools we can get to help us navigate it. And again, that's how we get back to the primer here that Nolan and I put together, that we really tried to help people understand these things, not telling them what to think, not telling them what sides to choose, but trying to remind people the importance of constructive communication and civil and civic discourse. A big part of our study, of course, looks at the role of media censorship, and deplatforming. Of course, we oppose censorship and deplatforming, and we see it as a form of propaganda. We talk about what it means to be a model media citizen. We talk about how to understand journalism, publishing, source bias. We talk to people in the book about how to understand evidence. We also talk importantly about the Society for Professional Journalists, social media ethics, what it means to be an ethical journalist. And we wrap it all up in the end where we tell people that we want them to try to get critical. Critical doesn't mean to be negative. Arguments are not the same as fights, right? And I see this all the time when in the classroom. I come in and start talking about arguing. I'm going to argue. And a lot of them, most of the students say, you almost see a triggering in them because they equate arguments with fighting, negativity, hostility. They equate it with not listening, not understanding. And right there is already where we've already kind of lost that argument, right? And I remind them, I'm like, look, this isn't chair throwing. Mari Povich is now leaving the stage. This isn't about I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what. An argument is constructing the story. It's constructing evidence. It's sharing information. It's basing disagreement on evidence, not other frivolous things. It's about honestly trying to understand another position, not purposely distorting it for your own gain. It's about empathetically listening, not just waiting till it's your turn to prove someone wrong again. And so in the book, in the end, we use the word critical to spell out these 8 things that we hope will help people better understand our case for learning how to agree to disagree, and by thinking critically, communicating constructively, and being critically media literate and civically literate citizens. And I'll end with this. We want to create constructive dialogue. So there's the letter C right there. Try to avoid defensive posturing. Try to come together where possible. Try to inquire, not be a know-it-all. Try to treat others as you want to be treated. Treat arguments as construction zones, not destruction zones. Model that behavior when others are being extraordinarily hostile and destructive in their communications. Pause that. Call attention to that. And make that the issue of communication before other things can possibly continue. Right? And that's difficult. And that sometimes is where we do have to walk away. Sometimes the agreeing to disagree means you can't participate in a particular conversation or dialogue because of the hostility, because of even danger, right? And this is something that we all need to, I think, address in our communications, in our own circles, where we like to argue vigorously with one another. How are we exchanging differing views, even amongst people whom we value or call our peers or our communities? We later, of course, the letter R comes into, and there's plenty more in the book. I'm not going to list all of these things here now. Reflect on communication practices and censorship, right? Watch out when we get into other sidism. When a conversation about politics, race, gender, or any possible dichotomous topic is in focus, it provides an opportunity to distract the actor or group and focus and examine the other side. Well, let's also talk about how there may be other sides, plural, right? Maybe just not 1 and 2. The binaries that our corporate media and political system try to funnel us into, often these ideas are far more complicated than only 2 sides. So we should reflect on how our communication process looks at that. The next letter is I, inquire. Be a critical thinker. Lead by example. The feminist Emma Goldman once said, the most unpardonable sin in society is independence of thought. We argue we need more sinners. We need more independent and critical thinkers, not group thinkers. A lot of groupthink going on in the United States right now. A lot of groupthink going on. And that's a real problem, right? A lot of piling on. When we saw the cancellation and the deplatforming of Russia Today, RT America, a lot of the liberal class, even people that I work with on the left, celebrated it as a horrible piece of propaganda and as a horrible outlet of propaganda. Good riddance. Of course, we know that those waves of censorship come and grow. And when we saw the left celebrate the censorship of Trump or of Alex Jones, hundreds of other progressive and left sites were censored and deplatformed in the weeks and months following, with almost no notice, with no pushback, and with virtual tech impunity. That is a real problem. And that's something that we have to remember, that there's always going to be another wave. There's always someone that wants to censor us. We should be very careful when we're cheerleading the censorship and silencing of others. We want to test theory and spot ideology because we want to have a context historically and intellectually where we can place all these ideas and a lot of these different arguments. It helps when we understand the history of them. It's kind of interesting and ironic that in the last couple of years, everywhere we turn, it seems to be the corporate media and the Republican Party they're experts in critical race theory. As someone that's taught social science for 20 years, I've never heard so much about critical race theory in my life. And it's interesting that most of the people complaining about it don't seem to know much about it. Just kind of like how the people that are censoring genderqueer. I was just on a panel with Maya Kababe the other day and Banned Books at Project Censored. We're part of the Banned Books Week Coalition. And we were talking about how some of these books became instant bestsellers because Ted Cruz is holding them up as the devil. And, interestingly, that doesn't really harm the author. Their book sales go through the roof, but it harms the subject and the people and the voices that are coming through it, right? And it's like dog whistling through a bullhorn, right? Dog whistling through a bullhorn. It's an interesting phrase. And that's what we see on the right, right? There is a vicious wave of this kind of hostility going on. And by the way, it's going on in Putin's Russia too. There's a vicious wave of hostility and of censorship, right? But I want to carefully remind you that this is also something that happens in different ways among liberals, progressives, and the left. And it's something that is not popular to say, but it is something that I will say again and again. And I decry it, and I don't believe in it, and I really try my best not to practice it myself. And I know others may disagree, and I'm really interested momentarily to hear about what you think about this. So I'm going to wrap it up here in a couple minutes. I'm halfway through the word critical. We also want to investigate and evaluate the mass media. We have to understand the political economy of media. We have to understand the control of sources and messaging and how censorship works. C is to critique content. What is fake news? What is propaganda? What is ethical journalism? Right? These are things that we really need to know this, and we need to teach each other what these things really are. And I mean, again, I think you go to the Society for Professional Journalists page and you look at it, you'll see they want you to report things accurately. They want you to be transparent and accountable. They want you to do no harm. Very interesting that that's one of the major ethical tenets of journalism. Turn on the cable news, almost any channel. And I don't think any of them are attuned to that one, causing no harm. And of course, we want to analyze digital media use and abuse. We want to understand how the digital space is being used and how we are being abused and used by our own use of social media. Using Facebook and Twitter and Instagram isn't free. It costs us. They are data mining and harvesting us to then use our own desires, our knowledge, and our information against us, to pit us against each other, in many cases as pawns on a digital plantation. So we must understand how social media work and how they use us. There are many books that talk about this, whether it's Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression or Siva Vaidyanathan's Anti-Social Media, about how Facebook has basically, worked in incredibly anti-democratic ways. So we need to be aware of that in order to counter it. And last but not least, leading by example. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And I would like to close with this. We are nearly a quarter of the way into the 21st century as we finish this book. And while the world has changed in many ways, certain power dynamics remain. And many see the United States as more divided than any time since its civil war. There's a lot of rhetoric around this right now. struggling with seemingly irreconcilable differences domestically and increasingly precarious situations internationally. That said, we wrote this text because not all is lost, and there is much we can do in the present to mitigate our differences and transcend tendentious trajectories. Our future living together on this planet, the one that faces an extraordinary environmental crisis, the only one we have. Our future living together on this planet with its volatile environment, climatically as well as socially, politically, and economically, depends on how well we can make logical sense of the world around us, understand each other in truly holistic ways, and even learn how to build bridges, not walls, and work together where we can, even if we agree to disagree. And I want to leave it with that. And I thank you for your patience, for your time, your curiosity, and interest in being here on a Sunday afternoon when you could be anywhere else doing anything else. And so I appreciate your, again, I do appreciate the invitation and your time. And with that, the book is titled Let's Agree to Disagree, A Critical Thinking Guide to Communication, Conflict Management, and Critical Media Literacy by Routledge. I will put the links again in here by my colleague Nolan Higdon and myself as a follow-up to our other book, United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation, and Post-Truth America, and What We Can Do About It, which all dovetail with the annual books we put out on the state of the free press, most recently Censored 2022, out from the Censored Press. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Justin, and I hope to be able to address your questions, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you again.
Great, thank you so much, Mickey. I love what this book is about, and I especially appreciate this underlying assumption that I think I see in it, that humans are intrinsically good, that there is a desire to communicate with each other and understand each other. So let's move into the question and answer and discussion period here. We have half an hour. Please keep your comments to 2 minutes, and then that way we can hear from as many people as possible, and then we can come back around if you've got another comment. And if you would use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, that will be the best way that I can help keep track of an order for the stack. And I already see one hand raised and a second. So first of all, let's go to Michael and Jan. Unmute and let's hear your comment.
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's hard to know where to start with this because I disagree with a considerable amount of what has just been presented. I think let me start with the 50s where you started. I think the 50s was a period of homogeneity in America for the most part. The level of dissent, of disagreement was relatively little. And I think that there's a reason for that, and that's something that you didn't talk about, which is that because America is a class society, and that the ideas of any epoch in America are the ideas of the ruling class. That's what makes this an issue. But what I really want to talk about is the question of separating the notion of critical thinking, which I'm 100% in favor of, from the rest of this. That I have to be not disagreeable to people with whom I disagree, and I don't agree with that in the slightest.
That's not what I said at all in the book, but I will let you continue, please.
Thank you. I think that the question of a lot of what people with whom I disagree with are talking about is death. I have nothing in common with them. I do not want to have a dialogue with them. I don't want to even be in the same room unless I have to be. I think that we have to be clear. And what you're not raising is the question of being clear. And I think that the thinking critically is not needed to agree with the rest of what you're saying, and that's the point that I really want to make. Over.
Okay. that's fine with me, but I never said anywhere in the book that you should have to agree with somebody or disagree with them. I never said you had to sit in a room with somebody. I didn't say you had to spend time with people you disliked or were hostile to. I just simply said that if you're going to try to understand those things and mitigate those challenges, shutting it off and shutting it down is likely not going to lead to a solution, is it?
I think talking to them is not going to lead to a solution either.
I talk to people I disagree with all the time, so I will respectfully disagree with you here and now.
Okay.
And I would like to talk to you further about your experiences that led you to have that kind of a position, because it's very important, because you're not alone in that regard at all. And I hear people saying similar things often, but I want to be really clear. At no point, at no place in this book, which you have not read, 200 plus pages, I just gave a 40-minute presentation on an overview. So there are many things that are addressed in this book that you are claiming I'm saying that I'm not. And I would like to invite you to take a deeper look at what the strategies are and why we're saying them, including the stable of experts that we're citing, that we're talking about, from psychology, philosophy, peace and nonviolence studies. In fact, one of the quotes that I didn't get to read, which I'll say right now, that I think addresses the concept that you're bringing forward. And I hear a lot of folks talk like you for good reason. And because I know that the experiences that folks have had have really polarized us. And we only have so much time in the day. And we want to make decisions about where we spend that time and energy, right? And spending it with people where we really disagree, that we find very negative and we find damaging, is not an inviting situation. So I understand that, and I get that. But you know, the late great Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote in The Art of Communicating, when we say something that nourishes us and uplifts the people around us, we are feeding love and compassion. When we speak and act in a way that causes tension and anger, we are nourishing violence and suffering. And for the challenge for me, I'm not sure what exactly your, where the fulcrum is for your specific challenge, Michael and Jan, Michael. But for me, it's trying to remember that when I'm in the throes of knee-jerking somebody and, really wanting to throttle them or run far in the other direction. I try to really get to the bottom of, why is this happening? Why is this person saying and doing this? So in my classic example in the book that I mentioned too, is that, if Daryl Davis, an African-American man, can sit down and talk to hundreds of Ku Klux Klansmen and collect their hoods and their uniforms and somehow find it in himself to totally disagree with them, but use his own life experience as a vehicle to change the way people behave hatefully, then I think there's hope. And Michael, I hope that maybe if you're interested, I hope maybe you give me a chance through this book to maybe convince you to revisit that subject somehow, even if you ultimately end up back where you are, and with your own conclusion, because it not only fits, but it makes a lot of sense to you because of your experiences and what's informed it. But I would be hopeful that you might at least give a chance to see the ways that we're trying to holistically argue, not just for how to mitigate the differences between me and somebody at the gas station, but how to work to heal our society in general. And I know that that's complicated and it's not easy, but I want to say that I really appreciate you disagreeing with some of the things that I said. And I appreciate you for sharing those ideas with me and with everyone here.
Okay, we've got a lot of people on the stack here. So next we'll go to Laura. And Mickey, I want to just say, if depending on what someone's comment or question is, don't feel like you necessarily have to respond to after everyone. It might be more efficient to take 2 or 3 comments and then take them as a group. But I'll leave that up to you based on how things are moving along. Laura, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Mickey, for the talk. And I wanted to talk about the critical, the bias toward critique, as opposed to having a bias toward coalition or solidarity. And one of the things that really struck me was that there were a couple of young people from Latin America who were on a show, and the young man had gone to the US, and he said he was really surprised at how it seemed like the socialist groups in the US saw as their primary thing to do to critique all the other examples of socialism in the world, and how it was the opposite of what he would experience. Is like where people would try to find ways to support something, ways to connect, ways to meet in coalition, in cooperation. And instead it's like critique, I'm right, you're wrong, you know, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to make that comment and or ask the question about what you think.
Laura, first of all, I have great respect for you and what you've done throughout your life as an activist, as a candidate, for really walking the walk, putting yourself out there and trying to make a difference and make a change. And anytime that happens, well, I don't need to tell you, the squad circles around. I like what you're saying, and I think that it's really important. That's also part of this book and part of the messaging of solutions journalism. It's not just what you're against, it's what are you for? It's not just what is the problem, but what can we do about it? And the corporate news cycle runs on a very negative bias. It's always, if it bleeds, it leads. Where's the next fire? And it keeps us in a heightened sense of, you know, it's like adrenal collapse. It's like an outrage culture, right? We have to be outraged about everything all the time. And that's not a sustainable state of being for humans. It's not healthy. Is anger productive? Yes. Can it be? Yes. Is criticizing the views of others a vehicle for understanding differences? Yes. But if we don't spend some time talking about the things that we are working to create and the things that we're for, to get support for those, we run the risk of getting sucked into the binaries. And that's what we point out in the book, is that we really run that risk. We run the risk of being pulled into a dynamic that is not actually useful for solving our political and social and economic challenges. And by the way, I just remembered something that Michael said, and that's also in the book. Class analysis is one of the most significant parts of intersectionality that is being ignored or weaponized by the left. We write about Adolf Reed Jr. in the book. We write about different kinds of reductionism in the book. And we think that it's a mistake among the left that is being seduced more and more by identity politics, that we seem to be getting more away from Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality going back to 1989, to give it a term. And if we're going to be intersectional, my critique is always, can we make our intersectionality more intersectional, please? Can we be sure we're trying to do as many of the things as possible, walking and chewing gum, even though we're tripping and choking, but the effort is well worth it, in my opinion.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Janet. Go ahead, Janet.
Yeah. Hi, everybody, and thank you, Mickey. So everybody, or most, I don't know, most people have opinions. And so how do they get those opinions that you've talked about? But I kind of think that listening is maybe more important than, or I'd like you to just respond, but I want to say a few other things. But how, if somebody has an opinion, sometimes they're not going to be open-minded to listen. You have to be open-minded somehow. And how do we get there? How do we help people get there? To, yeah, empathetically, actively, critically listen, as you have talked about. I have also I'm involved in I'm an activist, an eclectic activist in a lot of different things, including Pacifica, Israel, Palestine, and currently the Ukraine situation. But and there are factions within these groups, progressive factions and groupthink. So you have, how do you deal with that? I mean, that's a hard one too. But one of the things that I have wanted to experience on the radio in particular, and I guess TV, I don't watch it anymore, but is debates. But in order to have a debate, you have to have an objective moderator. And where do you find that? Somebody who can actually do radio, who can do that. That's very hard. And then you have with Pacifica, for example, you have rules, Robert's rules, and having to follow those. And that kind of restricts how debate goes. And so it's difficult to, and people, you know, are they going to listen when there's a debate? And then there are people who are chairing the meeting and they maneuver or manipulate the rules. But I'll just throw out a few other short things. Whistleblowers, how are they treated? You know, we know, but you know, it's like if somebody has an opinion, they're not going to listen to whistleblowers. There's the big lie, and also the advertising industry. Where does that come into this whole thing?
We talk about all of that in the book, Janet, and I actually talk about it on air, as you know, and we try to have some different opinions on the Project Censored show. Coming up soon, I have Eric Draitser on to give his perspective on Ukraine, Russia, which is pretty different than Aaron Mate or Gray Zone. It's fairly different than some other left groups that you'll hear. And I think it's important for the anti-war left to have these discussions and have these debates. I'm reminded by the late, great Stephen Cohen, for example, or Josh Mearsheimer, who has different views than we hear certainly in the liberal class. I think it's important to have those debates. And, you know, friend and colleague of mine at KPFA's Mitch Jeserich in Letters and Politics is one place where I think Mitch does make an effort to try to have discussions and try to have debates and try to have different people on the left have different views and opinions. And I'm doing that more on the Project Censored show because that's actually what I like doing and enjoy doing. And, you know, we get hate mail either way, no matter what we do. If there's another show, there's going to be somebody that doesn't like what I'm doing, but that's fine. But the antidote to that is having somebody go do something else, right? But I'm always open to hearing other ideas. I'm open to hearing people that would be guests, right? That's always something that I think is important. To start with your real quick, I think the empathetic listening is a huge thing. We have a whole part of a chapter on that. It's really important. And I think it's also important to talk about, KPFA did used to call itself Free Speech Radio. It really did. I remember I had the bumper sticker, right?
Still does.
It was on a bumper sticker, so it must have been true. But, you know, a few years ago, I remember, you know, it kind of was like, no, that's not what we do. Don't say that. That's not what we do anymore. And I thought that was really curious. I'm not going to get into the weeds on who or what was saying that, but I thought it was really fascinating because it's like, okay, it's advocacy media. I get that. But, you know, I really think that I was just speaking at the Alliance for Community Media conference Sue Busk put on with Tracy Rosenberg and others. You know, and that was a real focal point. It's like community media is a place for radical, different voices. It's a place where people should be able to disagree, and we should hear these diverse opinions. And I think we're much better off if we're hearing about these different people on the left that have these different ideas and not just pushing them off, you know, off the radar entirely. You know, and speaking of which, and I know Amy's been capital lettering me in the in the chat room. I hear all of your capital letters. I actually have talked about some of these issues. I've taught about some of them. Project Censored isn't a one-issue organization other than outside of censorship, but we hit a lot of subjects and topics. And you know, if you're interested, Christian Parenti, the son of Michael Parenti, obviously a left author, Soft Cage, many other books he's done. He wrote a really fascinating and critical piece of the left on COVID policy over at the Gray Zone, which again, we could argue about several people there, and we could get into all kinds of arguments. But I think my main argument is allowing for those differences to happen and to fact check and source check and see what we have at the end of the day. But most other places wouldn't even publish that critique because it doesn't go lockstep in one way. And I think that anytime we see any media going lockstep in any one way, we should be alarmed. We should be cautious. We should be concerned, and we should really start being more active about how we get information. Thanks, Janet.
Great. Next up, we have Sarah. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Sarah.
Oh, hey, let me put my video on. So I'm at a loss. So you know that I worked in the 5G campaigns. So I've had since 2017, knowing that media lies, media pushes the disinformation campaign, and whoever their advertisers are, and they will be pushing that narrative. So that was already my mindset. I had no idea it would get so profoundly worse. So sorry, that's what the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I found my stance is the same as it was in 2017. I don't trust corporate propaganda. I don't trust corporations' influence on politicians. I've seen us fight New York Times. We couldn't get a board of directors in Sierra Club to say yes to a resolution we all passed nationally and through California because of New York Times. Oh, the New York Times says 5G is absolutely safe. It's good for babies. I'm sorry, I just want to gag. And then people believe this. People believe it because they listen to their news media. I shut down the news like 8-9 months ago. And any corporation, if it's profitable, so who's the biggest advertiser? And I'm concerned about transparency. I'm also concerned about, I got pushback for stating my views. When I see corporations push wedges between people, divides, it really upsets me. You know, it's painful. And it's breaking apart families, it's breaking apart friends, and it's breaking apart political groups, you know, and we're not having shades of gray. It's binaries. And I'm at a loss. I'm going to be very upfront. I'm really against mandates. I think mandates are corporate binary. When, you know, there's never been one solution in medicine ever, you know, and I was frustrated and still am frustrated. And I know that mandates have lifted and, you know, and as personally, I'm frustrated because I came back from New York in 2020 really sick and probably most likely had COVID because I came back from COVID Central. And people were scared of me afterwards. Like, you know, like, oh God, maybe I had COVID and I'm like now scaro biohazard person or something, you know, and it's just like not okay, you know, and I haven't had COVID since, but everyone's scared of me, whatever. So I'm just like, okay, if you're scared of me, you don't have to be around me, but I really am a cautious, careful person who cares about other people's well-being. But there is something about COVID immunity, you know, so anyway, and that people don't believe that. And it creates divides. But I think this is being driven by the media. And I'm wondering, what would you advocate? Because I think mandates are really corporate driven.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, take a look at the profits, $20 to $30 billion just in a year on that issue alone. Again, when I see people on the left talking about how they're virtue signaling Team Pfizer or Team Moderna, I quickly post how they have record fines against them for producing things that have killed thousands of people. Johnson & Johnson, by the way, is in the middle of trying to restructure their corporate governance so that they can create a side group so they don't have to pay for asbestos victims or talc victims. So I would remind people that, you know, just because you may believe that whatever the propaganda is a life-saving product, let's not forget that the people peddling them are drug pushers, and they've killed millions of people with other products. Imagine that both things can be true at the same time. And this is what I mean by having that conversation. Somebody doesn't have to agree with you about that issue. They may support mandates. They may think that this is an important thing to be doing. The problems that I have are when that shuts down and when that breaks down and when it gets to name calling and ostracism. That's what I'm opposed to, right? That's what I think is problematic, and that doesn't allow us to understand each other. And real quick, just because there's a couple other people that want to talk, and we could talk about this one for a long time. But I think that I think the way in which that we're approaching the topics is how we set ourselves up for failure. And the media loves we got anti-vaxxers over here, pro-science people over here. Again, it's back to that abortion issue. We got different labels, different language, different values operating at different times and different hierarchies with no institutional moderator over how those issues play out. Throw on the mix, you've got multi-billion-dollar transnational corporations making profits from all of it, whether it's big pharma, big ag, and the military-industrial complex. I mean, the world is aghast in many ways of what's happening in Ukraine, but in many cases in the US, I don't remember seeing Hollywood so freaked out about Yemen or Somalia or Ethiopia or Palestine. And that's not whataboutism for whataboutism red herring's sake. That's whataboutism for context. That these people can be easily led around by the nose by media is part of the problem. It's that they're knee-jerking into a feel-good confirmation bias rather than addressing the complexities at hand. And rather than, by the way, before getting our hot take on it, the war needs to stop now. The war needs to end. The killing needs to end wherever it's going on, not just because we're looking at Ukraine. And that's part of the message that's getting lost, where we're having people virtue signal about closing the skies and no flies. That's going to kill people. And I had Peter Kuznick on to talk about how, in many ways, with Harvey Wasserman. And, you know, I'm reminded of another story that I want to share before I leave, but because it involves Dan Ellsberg. But I'm going to pause on that because I want to hear from Kathy, James, and others.
Yeah, we are getting close to the end, 5 minutes left. So after Kathy, we'll close the stack, but go ahead, James. Go ahead and unmute and state your comment or question.
Mickey, I just wanted to thank you for coming on and talking to us, and good luck with your book. I hope it's good sales. And on that last topic, you know, yeah, it does seem like it's Taibbi's pro wrestling is the way this whole thing is organized.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about you know, how to work, you know, to have those discussions with opponents, and you know, and I don't think of them as my enemies. You have to think of them as opponents, and try to have that kind of discussion. And I have, at least in the past, with one person who over a course of a year, I turned from a Trump supporter to a Bernie supporter. So that was an interesting, but it was a lot of work. So I've started reading a few months back. I started reading who I consider my opponents. So I started reading foreign affairs articles, and I've read about 80 of them now. And I've been really surprised at how, you know, I'd expected to see some kind of a debate, you know, within that. And this is also another echo chamber. So here, these are the wannabe elites of the future writing articles, and they all come off as neocons, you know, trying to demonstrate their credentials. So that kind of discussion within the elites doesn't seem to be happening, at least in that semi-public forum. And I've also been reading recently this book, Science of Coercion by Christopher Simpson, which is about propaganda and manipulation. And that's been going on and strengthening since World War II, especially, and how that is impacted this whole method of communication and manipulation of people. And what I find is when I want to read something and understand it, it's hard work. And the people that I talk to, you know, and you know this, the people that I talk to that, you know, that are and these are people that you know, universities and stuff. So many people are not willing to do the work, you know, of really reading things critically. I mean, it's hard work. They either don't have time or they just like, and so it's a little bit discouraging, you know, how this all comes about, you know, and I think, and it's for me, I see it all coming together is this dividing us into two camps, and this binary and everything is really, you see this so much now at the whole issue about Ukraine. It's just like,
it's everywhere, every topic is subject to its own binary.
Yeah, and I just don't, you know, and the thing, and I'm hoping your book, when I read it, will help me get past it. But I'm wondering if the book includes a number of tools. Like one of the things I do is I go to there's a wiki page called Propaganda Techniques, and it's got about 50 of them. And I have a list of it there typically next to me when I'm reading some articles, especially those foreign affairs articles. And I'm wondering if your book has those kind of, short lists. There's
Sure
also
does.
a good one on war propaganda. There's a list of 10 war propaganda techniques that pop up in what is it?
The book is full of lists.
And
It's a textbook.
Anne Morelli's war propaganda techniques. So if you read an article about the war, if you see any of 3 or 4 of those, that it's just written as propaganda.
And online, I would check out Propaganda Critic and Prop Watch. Propaganda Critic and Prop Watch was just on Prop Watch with Nolan last week or 2. And we just had a conversation about all this with Mitt Press, Manar Adley, and Alan McLeod. So yeah, James, it's really good to hear that you're doing that work, and I would love to carry on that conversation more with you, but thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks for those two links. Propaganda Critic.
And it looks like our other participant, Kathy, who had her hand raised, dropped off. So I don't know if she's going to come back or not. But at this point, we're going to turn it over to you, Mickey, to do your final comment, and feel free to wrap up.
So I will, Justin. Fake news. Just wanted to put out another book, Nolan's other book that I didn't co-author with him, but we teach the same stuff. So it feels like we finish each other's sentences. It's called The Anatomy of Fake News. And I'll put the links in here. It's a critical education about news literacy, but it also is like a history of the issue. And there's a whole fake news detection kit, propaganda detection. So the kind of stuff that James was just referring to it's also in here. It's in his book, Anatomy of Fake News. And we have a new book coming out because we're also publishing at the Censored Press now. We have a book with multiple diverse authors coming out this year for young people called The Media and Me, that's directed towards teenagers, and it addresses all of these issues. So real quick, and this is really timely because this is about Dan Ellsberg. And Dan, again, the threat of nuclear annihilation and nuclear war, something that Dan has cared about for over half a century. He just turned 91. And this was a story that I had remembered and forgotten. And the historian Randy Rourke, Beat Generation scholar, wrote this, and I'll be brief. But to me, it was interesting that I was rereading this today, coming to talk to you all, because it really encapsulated the message that I would hope, at least one message out of many that people might take. A man named Dan worked for the Rand Corporation in the mid-'60s analyzing data. While he was working there, he came across Jack Kerouac's books, and he read On the Road and Dharma Bums, and was particularly intrigued by Kerouac's portrait of a character based on the poet Gary Snyder, who Kerouac renamed Jaffe Ryder in his novels. At the end of Dharma Bums, Jaffe Ryder goes off to Japan and there visits a rock garden in Kyoto. It's a scene Dan never forgot. Later, Dan got a job at the Pentagon, where he was analyzing sensitive war data, and at one point his work took him to Japan. He still remembered the description of the Kyoto garden, so he went to Kyoto to see it for himself. After visiting the rock garden, he went to a bar where he had trouble reading the menu, which was in Japanese. 2 Americans at the bar noticed he was having difficulty and came over to help him. They joined him at his table and began talking. When they introduced each other, Dan discovered that one of the Americans was Gary Snyder. Dan looked closely at Snyder and said, "You're the reason I came to Kyoto." Pretty serendipitous, eh? The 3 men ended up talking all night about the war in Vietnam and their feelings about the Pentagon and the general issues about the war and peace. Even though Dan was working for the Pentagon and Snyder and his friend were Dharma Bums and wild and woolly poets, they found a way to talk to each other with mutual respect and to make a personal connection. At the end of the night, Dan said that he could still not bring himself to take the pacifist argument seriously, but he found himself deeply moved by the conversation. In fact, when Dan returned to his job at the Pentagon, he found he could no longer allow himself to quietly analyze the secret war data that was being kept from the American people. And so Dan, we know him as Daniel Ellsberg, photographed what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers and delivered them to the Armed Services Committee of the Congress of the United States. and the rest is history. We never know who we're talking to. We never know who we're going to meet. We never know when we're able to cross a bridge with somebody if we're only going to build a wall. And I know it's easy to build walls. Well, Trump had some trouble, but metaphorically, it's not easy to build bridges, and we have to maintain them. And my one message is that people take whatever they do. When we talk about agreeing to disagree, you take what you think are the best elements of that work in your life. We wrote this book to try to give tools to people that they could find ways to use in their life and their lives. And maybe it's not for everybody, and maybe it's not for you all the time. And then later you flip to another chapter and you're like, that's something I'm ready to use now. That's the spirit in which we wrote the book. And we really wrote it with the hope that we can play to our better angels. I'm just reading another study today that showed that a majority of Americans still believe in those things. A third of Americans still believe in ghosts. If we can still believe in some of those things, then I believe we can still agree to disagree. And again, if anybody got anything from this, I'm delighted. If people don't want to disagree and carry on the conversation, you can contact me through the Project Censored site at mickey@projectcensored.org. You can tune into us at KPFA at the Project Censored show. And again, I just want to thank all of you for inviting me here, because I know some of you don't agree with some of the things that I might be saying, and you may not even agree with each other on certain topics. But I want to give you all an A for effort, because inviting me here shows that some of you are, kind of like James said, willing to do the work. And it's really the work of a lifetime. And I'm humbled that you asked me to come, and I hope that I can contribute more positively to your broader community in the future. So thanks again, Justin.